Hi, this is Jim Janossy, and these are the slides for Chapter 9 of the Gombrich textbook. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about Europe once again in the Middle Ages to the late Middle Ages. Gombrich entitles this chapter The Church Militant, and you'll see why in just a few minutes. Here's a slide you've seen a couple of times. Once again, we're talking about this area here of Western Europe. This is a Romanesque church. Romanesque churches used heavy stone walls and rounded arches, but very little surface decoration here. They gave the impression of standing as a holy bulwark against the forces of evil, and that's why Gombrich entitled this chapter The Church Militant. Now here's another Romanesque cathedral. You see here once again the rounded Roman arches. See some square towers and then these big imposing steeples here. This type of a window, a rose window, became popular. It really is supported here by a circular arch, very large arch. This tracery here, you've already had an exercise that showed you how these were laid out. This tracery just supported the glass here, glass that was colored with minerals and made to have various patterns or even figures. Here's the interior of a Romanesque cathedral, also called a Norman cathedral. In Europe they were called Romanesque. In England, after the invasion of 1066, they were called Norman because the invaders came from Normandy. Very thick stone walls here. You'll notice the rose window. Here are crossed circular arches. They give the impression, when you look down here, of being a pointed arch. But these are really circles, crossed arches to support this portion of the roof. This would support the roof, and this space in here was filled in with lighter material. And that was kind of an innovation to build a roof that wouldn't be all solid stone. Now here we see a church in the Romanesque style. There's still several elements of Roman architecture here. This sort of has the look of a Roman triumphal arch. Same here with a smaller door on either side. This pointed roof here is very much like a Greek temple. And once again you'll see columns, Corinthian columns in these cases here, and a symmetrical appearance to the church. But not much decoration here, very plain, still looks pretty much like a bulwark. But let's take a look at this area here called the tympanum. Now here we have the decoration of the tympanum of the Church of St. Trophin. We have Jesus in his resurrected glory surrounded by the four gospel writers, but symbols representing them. So we have here a winged divine man for Matthew. Looks like an angel. We have winged lion for Mark, and a winged ox for Luke, and the rising eagle here for John. Now you can't see it very well on this illustration, but we also have here people on this side and people on this side. People here are being taken up to heaven. People here are being sent to hell. Here we have a face for each of the 12 apostles. You'll notice symmetry, 2 on this side, 2 on this side, with a central figure, and these simply arranged in a row. These people going to heaven, these people going to hell. Symmetry played a big role in design in the Middle Ages. Now here is a candlestick made of perhaps silver covered with gold, or perhaps even solid gold. Something that's built up similar to that carving you saw earlier of the dragon on the front of a ship. But here it's made up of little figures of people, apostles, evangelists, for whom light serves to overcome darkness. And that's kind of the theme here. A very large candle would be put up here. And here we have a baptismal font. In early Christianity, a person joining the faith would be fully immersed in water, but this actually stems back to something called Solomon's Sea, a large tub placed outside the Jewish temple. So in a way, this harks back to the Old Testament beginnings of Christianity. Around here we see a lot of figures, including the baptism of Jesus. This plain background kind of makes these things pop out. This has a biblical basis also because it's been described that the Solomon's Sea, this tub, was supported in this way by 12 oxen, 3 each facing in a different direction. Here we have a scene called the Annunciation. This is where the angel Gabriel is telling Mary that she's going to be the mother of Jesus. This is kind of a gesture. That's a symbol. It's the body language of the era for someone who's speaking. And this upraised hands is a gesture of surprise. Now the background here is lavish in gold, but it's plain. And the colors are very vivid. And this was a signal in that era. These individuals are very special because only the wealthy could afford very vivid colors. So figures are drawn flat, but very delicate and artful. And the fact is, we're still seeing here a perpetuation of that style from a few hundred years earlier. This is intended to remind people who can't read of a religious event. It's not intended to be particularly realistic. There is a certain amount of shading to these faces, which does give them a little bit of shape. They're not completely flat. Here's an interesting example. This is called a monastic calendar. This central part here just shows a scene of a visit of some prominent religious person to perhaps the locality. The top and the bottom are reminders of 2 saints' days that occur in this month. This one is an illustration of how Saint Reun and his companions were murdered. Rather grotesque. These are headless torsos, every one of them with the head chopped off, because apparently this saint and his associates were killed by having their severed heads thrown down a well. The bottom is a reminder that Saint Ursula was martyred by pagans shooting arrows into her. So the purpose of this was to remind people of 2 holy days that came up during this month. And you see here once again the idea that symmetry, things arranged in a neat way here, one figure here, one figure here. This is also rather symmetrical. And this in a way is symmetrical because of the arch here and the arch here, even though there's 1 seated figure and 2 standing figures. Now this is an example of stained glass, and from around 900 onwards this became an art form that was very heavily favored. So factories were set up to manufacture glass in areas where there was a ready supply of silica sand, and the glass was colored by adding metallic oxides to the melted glass in a clay pot. So copper oxides were added, they produced green, cobalt, produced blue, gold added, produced red. The glass that was colored in this way was called for some reason pot metal. It wasn't metal at all, it was glass. It was rolled into a ball using a metal tube and then rotated to form a large cylindrical bottle, which was then cut open and laid flat on a stone. This produced a sheet glass that was a little bit uneven in thickness, which just added to the characteristics of the way it bent light coming through. These shapes were cut out. Supports were put in here, the most common being lead that was shaped into an H so that the glass would fit into either side of it, and then it could be soldered together so that it formed this kind of support. That lead, by the way, is called cames, C-A-M-E-S. From around 1300 onward, it also became a practice to use a stain on some of the glass. The stain was made from silver nitrate, and you could paint fine designs on the glass, and when you heated it, it adhered to the glass. The stain gave a yellow effect, so if you wanted to make a green, for example this, you might take a blue glass and paint it with this silver nitrate stain so that you would get this green color with the light filtering through. Now the most prominent colors here you see are blues and reds. Blue was often used as the color for holy figures, and red was used for backgrounds. So with the development of this art form, it became very much a goal of architects to open up as much wall area as possible so windows like this could be placed there. And that led directly to the development and refinement of Gothic architecture involving flying buttresses, which allowed some of the support for the church walls to be taken outside and some distance away from the wall, and the wall itself to be simply supported by columns with large open spaces between that could be filled with glass. So the idea here was to create a very grand type of a space where light from the outside would come through this glass and illuminate the inside with these images glowing very vividly. This end piece that Gombrich uses is kind of interesting. It's a page from a pattern book, and what you see here is an illustration of how people working in a monastery might actually use something like this, a reminder of how some figure is to be drawn. So this is an instance of this sort of a pattern. And you see this pattern book isn't really very detailed. It's only just a reminder of how this particular thing is to be drawn. Pattern books like this existed and were built up in monasteries, and that's how the same type of an illustration was used in one piece of work after another. That's the end of the slides for Chapter 9.